Welcome to the Centre for Brexit Studies YouTube channel. Today we're joined by Centre researcher David Hearne. So David, we're approaching 3 weeks of lockdown now. How are you getting on?
I'm in a relatively fortunate position. We have a small garden. It is only a very small garden, but it does mean that we're able to spend some time outside. I'm going for regular cycle rides. I have to say, there's been rumours about the government banning exercise. I think I'd go a bit mad if I wasn't able to get out on my bike. Just go on my own for half an hour every day, or some days. But it's a nice outlet. We had to be in self-isolation for a couple of weeks, and that was really hard. Not being able to leave the house at all is very difficult. So it's a bit of a lifeline, really, being able to get out and get some headspace.
Yeah.
But other than that, we're managing. I'm sorry not to be able to see family, but everyone is in the same boat. So
yeah,
hopefully this will be over before too long.
Now, obviously, the original plan was for the government to review lockdown measures next week on Monday, but now we're expecting lockdown to be extended. So do you personally think that we'll actually go back to normal within the next month or so, or do you expect restrictions probably until later this year?
It depends what you mean. I mean, I'm not an epidemiologist, so I can't comment on any of the, I can't comment on the mathematical modelling done by various teams whose research the government will be drawing on to try and understand this. I think it's obvious to any of us who watch the news that it's going to take a while before we know how efficient and effective the current lockdown and the current policies are being. So only once we know that will we really be able to make an informed decision about where we go forward. I don't envy the government having to make these choices. I think it's, again, I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a scientist. I do have some background in statistics. So I have a little bit of knowledge of that area, and I can certainly see that with the state of the stats at the moment, it's very much like looking through the rearview mirror, which is an inevitable challenge. We don't know the extent even of deaths in the community beyond late March, so the recent period. We don't know how many community deaths we've seen. We've got a very, very partial and incomplete idea of how many people have even been infected. We've not seen widespread testing, so that's a challenge. That's a problem, and that means that to a certain extent that pollutes the statistics, because as testing gets ramped up, and it does seem to be increasing more rapidly now, we're going to diagnose more people because we're doing more tests. So there's that element as well. And of course, we're only catching the most severe cases in hospital. So it's not clear. We have a vague idea of how many are affected, like Boris Johnson is affected, but we have a much far less idea of the Matt Hancocks of this world, for example.
So post-Brexit trade talks are continuing with the EU in these difficult times, according to the UK's chief negotiator. So are you expecting the deadline to be extended? And do you think if the deadline is extended, what do you think actually is next for Brexit then?
I think it's two things we need to be quite blunt about. One, Brexit's very much on the back burner. Let's be honest here. We've got literally thousands of people fighting for their lives in hospital. We have a situation where the government has suspended huge amounts of the economy. Vast numbers of people are not working, and huge numbers of the rest of us are working from home. We've got key workers who are exposed. We've got people who are not getting protective equipment that's needed. Now, whether that's because of distribution issues, whether that's because of a lack of stocks, is to a large extent irrelevant. People that need this equipment and people for whom having this equipment will slow and prevent the spread of this disease don't have it right now. That's all that matters. So Brexit is quite a long way back on most people's lists of priorities. That's true of those in government as well. So from a Brexit perspective, we also need to be cognizant of the fact that Michel Barnier has had COVID-19, and that David Frost, the chief negotiator for the UK side, was self-isolating for a while. We don't know whether he actually had it or it was just suspected. But the reality there is that actually we've already lost quite a significant amount of time in negotiations. The fact that negotiations are continuing really tells us very little beyond the fact that the two sides are having some form of digital meeting. There's none of the rapport that goes with usual trade talks, none of the face-to-face meetings that usually gets things done. So that's obviously tricky. We have a prime minister who at the moment is incapacitated and unable to, even if he wanted to, unable to take a decision on, what am I going to authorise, what am I going to not authorise. So I wouldn't read too much into the fact that negotiations are continuing. That really just means the two teams are talking to each other. It tells us very, very little about where we're going. In terms of an extension, it would be the obvious thing to do. I think the last thing we want to see is the massive dislocation caused by COVID-19 to then be compounded, and this might be continuing after Christmas. We don't know how long this is going to last for, and then compound that with Brexit. I understand this is an issue that's of very high ideological importance for some people, particularly within the Conservative Party, but also outside it. I understand and appreciate that people wanted to, the votes took place, but I do think that we need to be honest with ourselves and assess what are our priorities. If we can only do one thing at a time, then it's usually best to try and keep other things stable while we deal with that. And then we can go on and talk about what we want from these negotiations, what kind of relationship we'd like to see in future, and what the most important parts of that are. And if that means paying a little bit of extra money into the EU for 2 or 3 years while we finalise this, for me personally, I can't see the downside there. We're talking about a tiny sum of money compared with the amount that we're spending on propping the economy up at the moment. And if it allows us to get hold of some more ventilators, so much to the good.
Yeah. So earlier this week, new Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer announced his new shadow cabinet. So we've got Lisa Nandy, Rachel Reeves, David Lammy, Ed Miliband is back. So what do you make of this cabinet?
I mean, it's difficult to say, isn't it? You always find the strengths and weaknesses across all things. There's always a degree of politics in politics, surprisingly enough. But there's certainly some strengths there. I think the appointment of Miliband was interesting. I think on one level it shows that Keir Starmer certainly isn't afraid of appointing a former party leader. I suppose in that respect it's not particularly any different from Ian Duncan Smith being appointed, or William Hague earlier being appointed to the cabinet in the Conservative Party. But nevertheless, I think it's a bold gesture, and it's one that shows a degree of confidence. I think he has every right to be confident. I think he's clearly got a lot of support within the Labour Party to move forwards and perhaps do things slightly differently. So yeah, there's some big hitters in there. There's also a few points where you think, they're relatively new. They're going to be tested in a way that they have not been tested previously. I thought Lisa Nandy was a powerful appointment. I think that she's the dark horse in the race, and actually came across very well. She clearly speaks to a large number of Labour voters and former Labour voters in traditional heartlands, many of whom voted for Brexit, and she was very much a pragmatist on that issue, and said actually we have to do this, and whether you agree with her or disagree with her is irrelevant. It shows a degree of good sense, I think, on Starmer's part, bearing in mind his own background as a Remainer from London, to appoint someone like that, particularly someone who was his rival.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining me, David, and to those watching, we wish you all the best.
Thank you.